and welcome to the third Lindberg-King lecture. This lectureship was created in 2015 to honor two very distinguished leaders of the National Library of Medicine, Dr. Donald Lindberg and Dr. Donald King. Dr. King was unable to join us today, but it's a pleasure for all of us that Dr. Lindberg is here today, and he's sitting in the front row. I probably can't see that very well, but he'll have a more front and center appearance a little bit later in the program, and you can see the great man himself. I think there's more about both of these two men, as well as the prize itself in the back of your program, and you might just take a look at it. To introduce our speaker today, we have Dr. Patty Brennan, the director of the National Library of Medicine. Patty.
Thank you very much, Milt, and good afternoon to those of you who are in the room and those of you who are on the video cast. I'm Patty Brennan. I'm the director of the National Library of Medicine, and I'm delighted to be bringing our speaker introduction for this third annual Lindbergh-King lecture. You are in for a treat. The last hour and a half we've got to have a conversation at lunch. The preparation I've got to do reading about Dr. King's background has made me convinced that this is a man to know. He's been hailed as one of the world's computer science pioneers and a great visionary thinker, but I also find him an accessible conversationalist. But if you've interacted with computers in any way, with graphical interfaces or programming through them, you'd be doing so because of the inventions of Dr. K and his teams at ARPA, at Xerox PARC, at Apple, and in other areas. If you use one of these, you're using something that Dr. King thought about in the late 60s, before they even thought about persons and computers. There are no Nobel Prizes for computing, engineering, or technology, but the Nobel Prize equivalents, as many of you know, are the Turing Award from the Association for Computer Machinery, the Draper Prize from the National Academy of Engineering, and the Kyoto Prize. And Dr. K has received all three of these awards. It's sort of the EGOT for tech geeks. He's an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Engineering and the Royal Society of Arts, and this reflects his blended experience as a composer, professional jazz guitarist, a pipe organist, and a theatrical designer, as well as a thinker of cognitive and computing together. Our joy in bringing Dr. King to this particular lecture honors other great thinkers that we have known here in the library, particularly Dr. Lindbergh with his visions for bringing us, the library, into the network age, and Dr. King, who brought many, many advances in our thinking about how we bring basic biological and pathology concepts together with technology. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Don and Mary today, and also to recognize the organizers of this activity led by Dr. Milton Korn, currently our Deputy Director of Research and Education. We have with us also our event co-sponsors for this afternoon, Glenn Campbell and Dr. Barbara Redmond from our Friends of the National Library of Medicine we've been celebrating with for over a day now, and Dr. Doug Frisma here in the front row, President of the American I can't believe I didn't say it right, Doug, after all these years. American Medical Informatics Association. I've been an AMIA member for 30 years. I should be able to say that. But I want to now have you join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Kay to our podium and for a wonderful next hour. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much. Well, the first thing is the title is a little different. This is actually the title I wound up sending in, and it went through an NiMH low-pass filter, I think. But the best way to predict the future is to invent it is something I said in frustration back in 1971 at a meeting with some Xerox planners who wanted to know from their newly hired scientists what the trends were going to be in informatics. Like, what was IBM going to do? And I finally got so pissed off at the guy, I said, look, the best way to predict the future is to invent it, as long as we don't violate too many laws of physics. Few people with decent funding can do pretty much anything that they turn their mind to in the 20th century. And, of course, it doesn't say what kind of future. I had the feeling when I came to Washington this time that I was coming to a city in which people were very busy inventing the future, but not a really great one. So we have to be careful when we decide to be aggressive about inventing the future. And Milt, my question was, is it too late to invent a future? Milt said, well, how about healthy? Let's work healthy in. So, okay. So we have to think about, if we're going to invent a future, then it should be a healthy future. And after Dr. Don Lindberg, who the whole lecture is dedicated to, I decided I would dedicate this to Milt, partly because he's one of my oldest friends, and he also roped me into preparing this talk. And you can't say no to Milt. So here's what he said. He said, it would be good if you could say something about the future and health and medicine and computing and education. And my reaction was, oh, okay, thanks, Milt. Do it all in 40 minutes. But I used it as an excuse to find out a bit more. And I like to give acknowledgments up front, just because they tend to get lost at the end of the talk. And so I had a great conversation with Dr. Josh Gordon, who's here in the audience today, and with Heidi Schweingruber at the National Research Council, email with Betty Gallinger, and I had help with one of the staff members at Viewpoints Research. So I thought, well, let's unpack this a little bit. So this is what people really specialize in. And it used to piss me off when politicians took this route, but now I wish they would get back to it. Kind of want this, but they keep on doing this. And we have to talk about healthy. So my talk today is going to be about these two ideas. So one way of thinking about future, to me, future is not 5 years or 10 years. I think about the future as extending in front of us at least as far as the era that we live in, which I date back to kind of the invention of science or the early 17th century. So it's always worthwhile thinking 100 years or a few hundred years ahead. And a child born this year is going to be 82, and that's well within the expectations of when they should still be alive at the end. And so we have to ask the question, will they get there at all? And this is the first time in a while we were asking that question back when I grew up. I grew up during World War II, and I was one of the kids who hid under the desks during the Cold War. Many people here, anybody do? Yeah. So if you thought about what that meant, that was another one of those questions. Are we going to even get to this century? So that was 50, 60, 70 years ago. But nobody does what we do without being optimists, because a pessimist has already got 2 strikes against any idea that they have, so you might as well just be optimistic and ask about the best of it. And so the question is also, could they and the shape of the world get to the next century in better shape than now? Why not think about that? Not just staving off the various disasters that are happening. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and one of the interesting things about giving a talk to an audience like this that is full of sophisticated and educated people is there's hardly anything I'm going to say that you haven't heard, I think, one way or another. I'm well aware of that. But I'm trying to put some context on it. I like this idea because Einstein is suggesting something qualitative, that it's not doing more of what we're doing. And it means if we've done things with technology, for example, that have gotten us into a bit of a pickle, doing more things with technology at the same level of thinking is probably going to make things worse. And there's a corollary to this, which is, wow, if your thinking abilities are below threshold, below the threshold to realizing your thinking abilities are below the threshold, you're going to be in real trouble, because you're not going to be realizing you're in trouble until you've actually done yourself in. So what can you do about that? By the way, my field, I guess I would call it technology, or the computing field. It's probably not as true in medicine and the biological sciences, but in my field, it's singularly blind. Virtually everybody in the computing technology and the computing sciences has almost no sense of human history, of human context, of where we are and where we're going. So I think of much of the stuff that's being done as inverse vandalism. Inverse vandalism is making things just because you can. And if you've ever, how many people here have ever been to a flea market? Everybody, right? Okay, just think about the several 100,000 things in that flea market. At some point in history, in the past, more than one person had to care enough about each one of those little pieces of junk. So much that they not only invented the thing, but they made a bunch of them. Because there are very few items in a flea market that are singletons. So think about that. And now they're out in this flea market. So this is this kind of misplaced desire to just make things. Now, McLuhan had a nice saying about the future. Children are the messages we send to the future. But in the future that we're worrying about, it doesn't make sense to just go this far, just because part of our worries about the future have to do with human power. And so when we are sending a child to the future, we're not sending a message. We are sending the future. The future that's actually going to happen depends on the children that we send to the future. That's very different than the way most of us think about the future. Most of us think about the future is, what can we do right now to fix the problems that are going on? What can we do? But most of the problems took long enough to happen. Generations. It's going to take some generations to fix. And I'm very aware of this because the successes that we had at Xerox PARC in inventing much of the computing technology today were done by second and third generation graduate students in the ARPA research community. In other words, ARPA took such a long-range view starting in 1962 that their funding was not just for what the principal investigators they funded in 1962 were going to turn up, but their funding included making the principal investigators of the future, right? So this is a big idea. It's something I think that everybody in medicine and in some of the sciences actually thinks about. NSF has a hard time with this idea. NiMH probably doesn't. So this idea that it's not just about ideas, it's not just about technology, but you're actually creating agents to send forward. So three questions we have to answer during this talk, that I'll try to answer during this talk, are, well, what can children learn? Because if we just send children that are like us into the future, we're going to have what we have right now in the future. That's what's been going on. Because adults think the best thing you can ever do for a child is to turn the child out to be like them. Think about that. That has to be one of the dumbest ideas ever. Even if the adult is good, because it's missing the point of, for instance, how humans were several thousands of years ago, how humans were 100,000 years ago, how humans are now, how humans could be. And we need to ask, what do they need to learn? Because we don't want to teach them just anything, and how can we help them? So if we go back to this statement, we can modify it and at least say the best way to invent the future is really to invent the children who are going to invent it. So that's a nice meta thing. Notice this starts ruining the slogan nature of the thing. Unfortunately, pretty much nothing is very interesting in terms of slogans. I made up these slogans because I discovered most adults couldn't deal with paragraphs. But this group can, and I'll just fix it one more of saying what kind of a future. Now it's ruined as a slogan, but this is the way I think about what we need to be doing. Everybody read that? Whoops. Okay. Now, health. There's a meaning of health here that is really large. It's not just physical health. We have the Institute of Mental Health here. I would like to even try and enlarge it a little bit more than that. And to do that, I'll go back to something that happened to me when I was 7 years old in 1947. And for many years, I'd read every Life magazine that came in the house, but I turned up this one from a couple of years earlier that I'd never seen before. I was so surprised. I thought I'd read them all. So I started peeling through it. And I saw a picture of a little boy. He had a sweater just like me. He was just about my age, 7 years old. Walking down the road, and I couldn't quite see what was going on. Just strolling down the road. It took me a long time to see what was lying on the road. These, in fact, were the Margaret Borg White pictures from Buchenwald. Gives me chills. This guy, who was he? Haunted me to this day. I'd never seen anything like this because we didn't have television back in the 40s. Well, that was my thought. And then I blanked out for 5 years. Forgot it completely until I was around 12 or 13. Had nightmares, but I didn't know from what. But that little incident marked me for life. Not just the enormity of it, but the surprise of it, the unexpectedness of it, the thought, the organization and scale of it. And so when I started thinking about it again, whenever somebody mentions health to me, I think mental health. I don't even worry about bacteria. Mental health. What does that even mean? And there have been many books written about this particular genocide. This is probably the classic one. But of course, we've had Rwanda. I know some of the people who made it through that. This is probably the classic book from the standpoint that I'm talking about, because it has to do with the matter-of-factness of the executioners, who are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people and next-door neighbors. So unlike the German Holocaust, Rwanda was out in the open. And instead of done with science, it was done with machetes. And so it was a messy business that went on and on and on, and with the same tribe and with people from the same religion. So this was something that was kind of mind-boggling until you started doing a little research. And so there's a group called the Political Instability Task Force that counts genocides, and they were able to count 43 real genocides in just about 60 years. So it's not 6 million people, it's not 10 million, more like 50 million people, maybe more. Because remember, Stalin went after the kulaks. So when you start looking at this stuff, you start thinking about it. Oh, this is starting to look like normal behavior. It's kind of like war. This is not off to the side behavior. So, but then the other thought is, what's interesting is, if you look at the world population here, the United States has about 340 million people in it. And if you go back in time to when the entire world only had 340 million, which is about 1000 AD or so, what you see, whereas they had wars everywhere, then the United States hasn't had an internal war for 150 years now. So the entire population of the world somehow was being stable. And in fact, the European Union hasn't had an internal war for 75 years, and that's about 600 million. So what's happened is massacres and lynchings and murders are still happening. Right? So these are smaller versions of these impulses. But the larger societies have damped down these impulses. But on the other hand, these are really unstable, I think. Most people don't know that they're being peaceful, and most people don't know whether they're being genocidal. So it's a little bit like the climate, it's like other unstable systems. You push it over the edge and it just flips onto the other side. Rwanda was stable until it flipped, and then just everybody started killing everybody else. Now it's been stable again for a while. So this doesn't seem like a good way to go to the future. Seems like it'd be great for human beings to have more self-consciousness. Who are we? What are we? That kind of thing. I think everybody would agree with me on that. So, and I like to look at what is considered to be normal. And of course, this stuff doesn't necessarily follow anything like a Gaussian distribution. So this is, Dan Kahneman uses this great term, which is making up a falsehood that suits a narrative. But it's great because in a short story, you can't tell the complete truth. So I'm just picking a normal curve here. And if we look at the National Institute of Health, National Institute of Mental Health thing, what they classify all mental illnesses roughly outside of the normal. Creeps in just a little bit. It's about 16% is outside the normal, and it's 18%, but that's another little falsehood. But they like things that are outside the normal, and for instance, schizophrenia is less than 1%, and suicide thoughts are more popular. So I went looking for other things outside the normal. For instance, conscientious objectors. Going back in all of the wars that we've ever had in the 20th century, World War I and World War II and so forth, have always been just about 1/4% of the population has registered as a conscientious objector when they have to, when they get drafted. So what's interesting is, so 99.77% are not conscientious objectors. Doesn't mean they aren't going to shoot their gun in the air, because some people didn't register that, still didn't want to kill anybody. But as far as expressing an opinion, it's completely normal to be willing to kill others if your culture says it's okay. Completely normal. You know, but if we don't normalize, people here know very well that humans are basically delusional, right? We believe things, we project those beliefs out into the world. If we looked at what's the mapping between what we think is reality in here and what we think is out there, we'd see a complete mismatch. I would call that a definition of not being sane. Sanity without normalization should be something like how good is the mapping. But instead, we don't define it that way. We define insanity or mental illness simply outside of what most people actually do, no matter how crazy it is. So one question I thought I'd bring up here is just to ask, well, what if the normal human species is mentally ill or worse? I think this is provable. So, well, DSM-5 doesn't admit that, although you cannot beat the title of this book. I bought that book only because of the title. It's actually not very good. But there are people who do study normal. So Tversky and Kahneman, and they're also doing the work of what anthropology used to do, but gave up when anthropology got politicized, which is trying to see what people actually do, how people assess value, how they make decisions. And they came up with this idea of cognitive biases, and they've been collected. Maybe 150 or so have been collected so far. But in fact, if you read through these things, you immediately will think of things that aren't there. Like a simple one that isn't there is just the human confusion of what we think of as normal with reality. That's happening all the time. It's definitely a cognitive bias, just because we think about it. Another one that certainly is true in my field, and I bet it's true in your field also, as well as lots of other places, is take an idea that you've had, make it universal. This happens all the time in science. And then if the academics get hold of it, somehow now it must be learned. It gets turned into a catechism. It becomes a very unscientific thing, and particularly for young children. So I had a great conversation with Dr. Josh Gordon. And NiMH, it has a purpose. This is all from the website, Transforming the Understanding and Treatment of Mental Illnesses. Vision, a world in which mental illnesses are prevented and cured. Mission, to transform the understanding. It's got topics. But as we discussed in our conversation, where is Josh? As we discussed in our conversation, that, as you said, it's not in the charge of NiMH to really look outside these, to look at these things that are outside the norm and start looking at the normal. But, and I didn't want to put words in your mouth, but I had the feeling that you thought it would be a good idea if we started looking at them, particularly because part of your background was in psychiatry, and there you are. But what do you, as long as you're here, I put you on the, I gave you a chance, Josh. I sent you an email. What do you, is that okay? Okay. Well, he's being non-committal. Okay. In fact, looking at the website of NiMH, I could not find any place where it mentioned what the charge of. So I think this is something that's not written down. So here's somebody else who studied normal, but almost 400 years ago. I hope we have a party for Bacon writing Novum Organum Scientia in 1620. And what he said in there is, hey, humans have really bad brains. I'm translating from the Latin. And he picked 4 of his favorites that he thought were the most critical. Basically, our genetics makes bad brains, our culture gives us bad ideas, our languages can't represent ideas very well, and the academics keep lies going forever. And in this book, he said, we must invent methods to get around with what's wrong with our brains. Sounds great. In other words, heuristics. Once we know we're a noisy system, we can start inventing heuristics to start removing the noise. And he decided to call those heuristics the new science. Science, before he wrote this, was called the gathering of knowledge. And the new science is what we call science today, except for one important thing, and that is that science has kind of constricted itself down to study of physical facts and to some extent mental facts. But in fact, the learning of science, the learning of these heuristics to try and get around this noise that we generate, he advocated for every human. That is, it's something we should learn as we're growing up, is how to not get trapped by our bad brains. I thought this was a really great idea. It's kind of what we should be doing in school. So, looking at what children can learn and do, my hero, Jerry Brunner, he says this very confidently, but it's really a challenge. He says any subject can be taught to anyone in an intellectually honest form if we heed their level of development. So we don't actually know whether that's true. It's another expository fiction, but I like it. It's definitely as true as the best way to predict the future is to invent it. You know, it's in that mythic space. And so what does that mean? What does an intellectually honest form mean? And it basically means what we want the children to learn, whatever it is, shouldn't be a damaged version or a watered-down version that loses the quality of the real thing. Like if we're going to teach children mathematics, it has to be some form of real mathematics. If we're going to do it with science, it has to be some form of real science. And of course, children can learn to play real baseball. It's great to watch them. They can play real music. They don't need Guitar Hero. They don't need something to do it for them. They can do it. It takes a lot of work. Children can do real theater. They can write. There are so many things they can learn how to do. And we need to ask questions like this. What does real science in an intellectually honest form mean for children? So just looking at, like take baseball. Well, Ted Williams was one of the great hitters ever. How did he practice? Well, he invented the batting tee. Ted Williams did t-ball. He invented the batting tee because the hardest thing in baseball is hitting a round thing with a round thing and getting it to go where you want. And so he was the one who invented this and used it, and that's a great place to start children with. Children can run around, children can catch the ball, they can throw the ball. Hitting the ball is tough, so start them out with t-ball. And then pretty soon, they don't need the tee when they're playing, but you still want to use it in practice, just like Ted Williams did. Because it's just a special thing to be able to control, to get the bat to go just where you want it to. So one way of thinking about this stuff, for intellectually honest, we should ask, well, what's the T-ball? What is the T-ball? Don't worry about all the big stuff. How do you get them started? And there's a larger process. So Kahneman and Tversky had this idea of system 1 and system 2, these fictions. System 1 being kind of everything in our brain, no matter where it came from, that deals with fast things, patterns, basically non-cognitive. This is quite a fiction. So he says it's not really a system. But he grouped it together, and system 2, which is kind of cognitive. And the way things work is we can tell somebody something in system 2, like I'm trying to do here. But you know what? The biggest problem is that most of the processing in our brain is done by these fast systems. And if those fast systems aren't trained in a reasonable way, you can only take a tiny amount of advice. So one of the biggest problems in almost all ways of teaching people is to give them too much information. Teachers feel like they're not doing their jobs if they're not just telling you this and telling you that. In fact, it takes a long time to actually understand. And it's just as true in teaching music. I used to teach guitar, so I made these slides. So just a little bit of this. And then the hard thing is you got to get system 1 to start learning things, and it doesn't understand English. That's why it's hard to learn a sport like tennis or baseball. They can tell you what to do until they're blue in the face, but in fact your body won't do it. You have to somehow get to do it, and because you can't really talk to system 1 very well, you have to kind of trick it into doing it because there's a lot of drudgery involved, and the drudgery will drive you out. So the strongest way of making this happen for human beings over history is the stuff that's embedded in the culture, including something even like basketball. Kids will spend thousands of hours shooting baskets because it's popular. It's in the culture. It's something to be part of the culture of. They spend many, many years learning language. You have to have enough social sharing of the thing and a lot of this. So these 4 things pretty much have to be organized for every kind of activity you're trying to go after. So T-ball of math and logic, well, there's a lot of different ways you can think about it, but those of you who have a math background, if you think about it, an argument in mathematics has a lot to do with making something like a bridge. It's a bunch of structural connections between things that give you integrity in the whole. And for children, making things out of Tinker Toy really can make a difference. But you can also make logic. If you see the inputs over there on the left, either one of them going forward will cause the output to go forward. Everybody see that? So that's a good version of an OR. Put it on a pivot, so the one coming in, the spring will do the opposite. So that's a not, that's a negation. Put the thing that's being pushed against on a pivot, you can see that this will require both of them coming forward in order to move the thing. So that's an and. Only both of them will count. And in fact, you can make a whole computer out of Tinker Toy. This is one that Danny Hillis did when he was in college that will play Tinker Toy, that will play tic-tac-toe. And numbers are best thought of as things that you can take apart and put together, and so plasticine is very good for that. Rulers are good. Here's something that first graders love. Just take 2 rulers and you can beat a 5th grader in fractions. Everybody see how that works? right? And this is a far better idea about what number is because they're actually hidden vectors. They don't care about what the scale is. They don't care about integers. They get right to the meat of the matter and what addition actually is, and it generalizes in lots of ways. And in fact, many of these ideas, so for instance, you don't need trigonometry when you're in the early grades because all it is similar triangles. And the number one thing, as the Greeks showed, about triangles is they don't care what ruler measures them. In other words, each triangle is just a shape, and the ruler is separate. That gives you all of the scalings of triangles. And these ideas are very easy for children to understand. And for problems in trigonometry, anybody know what this is? Any pilots here? E6B. Yay. This is more fancy than the one I had in the Air Force, but I love it. And the nice thing about it, right, is you can solve all of the problems of different shaped triangles on this thing without ever using a number, without ever going to a trig table or any of that thing, because it takes you directly to it's basically a protractor mounted on a movable thing. So you get the lengths of the things, and this gives you the other side of it. So young children using these kind of analog computers can completely understand what it is that they're doing. And as we'll see in a minute, they can even bypass. So let me make sure. Yeah, okay. So I'll just do a little demo here showing what children might do with computers. So we dip into the paint box there, and we'll pick some paint, and we'll draw a little shape and maybe put some wheels on it. So a little car as seen from above. Put some headlights on it and a windshield. This will make me a little graphical object, and I can move it around. I'll call it a car. And so this is a graphical picture of this thing I just made, but I can also look at properties. So for instance, here's a movement property, car turned by 5. So this what I'm showing you is the ancestor of Scratch here. It's a little more powerful than Scratch. So if I start the script ticking, it's turning by 5, and I can get it to go faster there. If I drop in forward here, notice that it doesn't care about recompiling or anything. It's just as I do things, it's making things. And I can steer it here by go the other direction here. But steering it this way is not very much like a car. What I really like to do is to make a little steering wheel. So I'll just come here and I'll draw one. This is just another object. So I'm just drawing objects here. Same kind of thing. I'll call it a wheel. I'll peek inside it, and here's a property called heading. And so if I turn this wheel, we can see that number. Oh, it's going negative that way. It's going positive that way. But changing this number by the turn there caused the car to change. So if I drop this information from the wheel right in there, then maybe I can now control the car by steering the wheel. So this is how a 9 or 10-year-old learns about variables, learns about programming, learns about loops. So you can learn a lot of things about programming in just a few minutes and start thinking about what you really want to do. Now for reflection, we can drop dots. Here's a little car that we want to move sideways. so what I'm going to do is take the x parameter on this thing, and I'm going to increase it by, let's say, 80 or so each time I click on it, and so it's leaving evenly spaced dots behind from each one of those things. But what I'd like to do is to actually play around with acceleration. So I'll say, if I take this variable, increase it by, let's say, 20, and I will change the position by the speed each time, you can see that, in fact, I'll drag this out so you can see it. Speed starts off at 0, and now it's going 20, now it's going 40, now it's going 60, 80, 100. Okay, so each time it's adding to the time that's spent, and if I reset it here and just tell it to go, soon it's off the screen. Okay, so this is a visual way of children thinking about velocity. And now if I come back to science, this is kind of a math way of thinking about things. I can take my cell phone and an air hockey table and see what happens. Well, the problem is it's too fast to see what's going on, but I can look at every fifth frame, and I can measure, and I see, oh, the distance traveled between every fifth frame is the same, and that's what's going to happen when I don't have anything influencing this hockey puck. Now I can examine the real world of
And the
gravity.
objects that you think will fall to the earth at the same time.
So the kids bring in round things about the same size.
Okay.
Some of them are heavy, some of them are light.
Attention to what anybody else is.
What's going to happen if we drop them off the roof of the building? Most of them think the heavier one will fall faster, just like Aristotle did. They've got stopwatches.
What do you get? What'd you get?
But when did the guy drop it? When did it land? Stopwatches are terrible.
Together. So put sponge ball.
Okay.
I think we should do the shot put and the sponge ball because they're two totally different weights. And if you drop them at the same time, maybe they'll drop at the same speed.
Drop.
So we've done this many times, and in a class of 30 kids, most of the time there'll be one Galileo kid. That was this girl in this case, where she cut to the chase, realizing what you want to do is listen. You just drop them at the same time. Don't even bother looking at them. You can hear whether one or two are hitting at the same time. And so she was able to deal with something that Aristotle couldn't deal with. By the way, Aristotle got the number of teeth women have wrong, even though he was married. Think about that. He was so incurious he did not look inside his wife's mouth. Okay. So we want to, in order to find out what's going on, we want to look closer, and the modern magnifying glass is something like an iPhone. You may not know this, but if you have an iPhone, that camera on the iPhone will shoot at 240 frames a second if you want it to. Think about that with your children. Right? It's just set up for regular movies, but there's a little mode in there. You can change it to 240, and all of a sudden, you can stop a hummingbird's wings. Okay, so you capture that with the iPhone. And again, it's hard to see what's happening when you watch the movie. It's hard to see what's happening when you're single framing it. But again, if you take every fifth frame and we measure with these rectangles the distance traveled and compare them, this is a very nice visual way of doing the subtractions. Can everybody see what's going on? The exposure there is the increase in velocity every fifth of a second or so. And when the kids look at that, they say, oh, acceleration. They remembered from 4 months earlier when they did that car thing I just showed you.
And to make sure that I was doing it just right, I got a magnifier, which would help me figure out if the size was just right. After I'd done that, I would go and click on the little basic category button, and then a little menu would pop up, and one of the categories would be geometry, so I click on that. And here it has many things that have to do with the size and shape of the rectangle. So I would see what the height is. I kept going along the process until I had them all lined up with their height. I subtracted the smaller one's height from the big one to see if there was a kind of pattern anywhere that could help me, and this worked. So in order to show that it was working, I decided to move a dot copy so that it would show that the ball was going into the exact right speed and acceleration.
So he's matching up his simulation to the movie. And in fact, we can do it right here. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner, there's the simulated ball that's green, and I'll just click on the script here. We'll run the movie and the simulation at the same time. Everybody get that? Okay, so 70% of all college students that go through Galilean gravity fail to understand it. This is the thing you have to understand. The reason these kids understood it is because this intellectually honest form for their developmental level was used to present the ideas to them, and they were able to discover it from the actual raw data that they got with their phones. Okay, now I'm going to just rush through the next thing because I want to wind this up. But of course, physical sciences are much easier than the human sciences. That's why they got started earlier. It was low-hanging fruit that only took us about 190,000 years to get to. But it was still relatively easy once people started thinking about it. The T-ball of the human sciences is a little more complicated because, as we all learned when we first took our biology courses, almost all nervous activity looks at differences of things. Basically, all of our senses essentially differentiate signals, and interestingly enough, that actually extends in many ways into our cognitive stuff. And so we're super attracted to differences and often don't like them so much. But what's different is basically parametric to what's similar and important. And so the three simple ways of thinking about humanity is our minds are basically theaters full of stories. George Miller with showing us our minds are really tiny theaters. And most of our mind is not human. Basically, most of it is from our animal past. And we're more theatrical, we're tinier, and we're less human than we assume. And Jerry Brenner took on his task of seeing whether he could present an intellectually honest form of humans to themselves. It was called Man, A Course of Study. Now it's called Humans, A Course of Study. And it started off with these three questions. What makes us human? How do we get that way? How can we become more so? Study of instinct. Here's the herring gull chick. Knowing tapping on the red spot will cause something good to happen. Primate societies, baboons, child rearing. And guess what? We're primates. The focus of this wonderful curriculum for 5th graders was on a completely different society. And the aim of it was to get the children to find the similarities, the categorical similarities between a human society, to see the Eskimos as humans, and to be able to realize that the similarities are categorical, the differences are parametric. So this is a wonderful thing. It had a bad end. We can talk about it in the discussion, but it was a great thing to do. Okay, last idea here is to look at human imagination. And we sometimes think that we're not very imaginative, but the problem is we are, just on some odd ideas. So 77% of Americans believe in angels, 94% believe in supreme beings, not 0% of Americans believe in sacrificing children to the gods, 50% believe in demons and ghosts, 21% still believe in witches. And I just threw this in because I had the space. But a great book to read if you like this kind of thing is called The Great Cat Massacre. So, anybody ever see this book? Okay, this is one of these things like a genocide, except it was a genocide of cats when they decided cats were the witches in France and causing all manner of bad problems. So they wound up killing 1 million cats. There's a book that explores how humans get these crazy ideas and then act as though they're real. We have a really hard time with other kinds of things which our imaginations are not set up, like even things that are going to happen to us. There's a woman in this truck. Notice this truck could roll over on this guy at any second. He doesn't know the woman. He just jumped in there to save her. Somebody's taking this with his cell phone. I think you jump in and help. Nope. Well, I got her out. So here's a book some of you may have read, which is just Why Can't We Imagine a Disaster? We can be heroes in a real disaster. Why can't we imagine a disaster? Why can't we be a hero ahead of time? What is our problem? And you think scientists would be good at this. Or doctors. So here's my dentist's office. I love this guy. He's Dr. Painless. But one day, he had his fingers in my mouth just like that and reached up and adjusted the light, which had plastic on it. And I said, Doctor, when was the last time you changed the plastic on the handles of that light? And he looked at me dumbfounded. He was shocked. It had never occurred. This is a guy who'd seen bacteria in a microscope. It never occurred to him that the plastic wasn't just a symbol that was warding off disease, right? Because guess what? All of our brains are like this. And so he instituted a rule that the plastic had to be changed for every patient. But in fact, you've been spreading germs from people's mouths into people's mouths. Eeks. And of course, doctors do this all the time. Maybe as many as 200,000 deaths a year from various kinds of sepsis problems in hospitals. Everybody here is aware of this, but Jesus, if a doctor with the training they had, and I went through pre-med training when I was on my way to be a biologist, if you can't believe in bacteria from raising the damn things in Petri dishes and looking at them on micro, what is the problem? What is the problem? Think about it. So we have a huge problem. So the main barrier and also the salvation are these adults. generally for children, the adults don't know enough, don't know how to help them. Parents and teachers generally don't know enough and don't know how to help them. On the other hand, if you can get people, like in sports and music, you're usually safer because you can find athletes, you can find musicians, sometimes you can find a scientist for a science club, computer guy for the computer club. These are the people who make the difference. Why? Because the children basically, genetically, are aiming to learn the most important things that they will ever know from the culture around them. It's the form of that culture that is going to provide for most children the most lasting impressions. Some children will be autodidacts and escape this. But if we're talking about doing something generally, and see what's interesting here is scientists should be able to get this easily. But the flood that we're ignoring, the thing that we're not building the dams for, is preparing the children for the next generation. We just complain about the state of the children when they come out of college. So I have a suggestion for this. So according to Heidi, who runs the Board on Science Education, is hardly any scientists go into classrooms to help the teachers. So right now we're relying on systemic change. Somehow we have to get school boards and politicians and parents who don't know anything about this stuff to make a dent. But holy smokes, how many scientists are actually available? Well, there's 1 million classrooms in K through 8. That's where we want to do the job. And according to Betty, just looking at ages 60 to 75 of people who are partially or fully retired who have scientific backgrounds, there's a pool of 2 million of them, just in that thing. So if you look at the total number of people who could help teachers, it's way more than the number of classrooms that need to be helped. And yet almost none of these people are getting into the classrooms to help. And thanks to Milt and the National Library of Medicine, I got these figures from NIH. Looks like there's over 9,000 people in NIH that could be out there helping raise better children to think better than their parents do today. I'm not going to ask this audience whether anybody is doing it right now. Some people are, because the AAAS, the other AAAS, the science one, has a mobilization for the Washington area. You can find it on their website. So, please, don't forget about voting, but of course you will. But if you want to do something right now to make an enormous difference and perhaps create more children that can create the bigger changes, get out there and help the existing elementary school teachers. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We're a little over, but I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. I'll give pride of place to Alan Kay's dentist. Is he here? No? Any questions from the audience?
The great guy.
He's not here. We're having a reception afterwards. I'd like to invite all of you to attend, and Alan will be there, and I'm sure we'll be happy to chat with you. And now we have the great pleasure of awarding the Lindberg-King Prize for this lecture, as we do on every occasion, and it's really a pleasure that Dr. Lindberg himself is here to make the award. And if you'll come up, Don and Alan, if you'll come up here as well. Just stand
Now, we've
there
done
with
a lot
Don
of
and
these
Chase.
things in theory and simulation. And in order to avoid smashing this beautiful crystal,
Yes.
Yeah.
We're not-
I'll award it to you in simulation if you
Oh,
don't mind.
this is for me.
Yes, it is
Oh.
for you. We're not actually going to lift it
Nobody
or throw
told me
it.
about this.
but
Thank you,
We're
John.
prepared to ship it to where you desire.
That's
But
And if you wish to see it full of cookies. We'll simulate that right now.
Okay, let's do the experiment.
Okay.
Thank you very
Congratulations,
Thank you
and
very
Thank
much.
you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure meeting you, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. So I discovered early in the game that in Washington, nobody believes anything if they don't see it on TV. So I hope we're getting this on TV.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, it'll be on the evening news. And now we invite all of you to join us for a little reception right outside here. And thank you for attending the lecture.